10, 20 years from now, how will we protect ourselves from cyber attacks? What will hackers be looking for, and how will we all avoid cyber catastrophe? That's what this first episode of our brand new series will be exploring, the future of cybersecurity. But before we get to that, I want to tell you about our presenting sponsor, Hays. Hays is the world-leading expert in recruitment and workforce solutions, specialising in the professional and technical sectors and skills. Big thanks to Hays, whose support allows us to bring you an ad-free podcast experience. To access great advice and insights from Hays, visit haztechnology.com/blogs. I'm Anne O'D, and this is Future Human, the series. In this series, the award-winning journalists at Silicon Republic will chat to some of the greatest minds on the future of everything. In this first season, we'll be reimagining the future of transport, of climate technology, of our urban spaces, of how we manage our finances and our health, in conversation with leading experts from around the world. This episode is all about cybersecurity. In 2016, Joe Sullivan, the security chief at Uber at the time, received an email from a hacker. The hacker said they had found a vulnerability in Uber's digital security. Sullivan soon learned that the hacker and their accomplice had gained access to the personal information of 600,000 Uber drivers and 57 million customers, including names and phone numbers. The hackers were demanding $100,000. Sullivan told only the chief executive at the time, Travis Kalanick, who gave him the green light to pay the $100,000. Sullivan got the hackers to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Uber didn't tell the public about it, and they didn't report it to the Federal Trade Commission, who were already investigating a breach that had occurred at Uber before all of this. The secret didn't begin to unravel until the following year when a new chief executive was appointed. And in 2019, the hackers pled guilty to the attack. In 2022, Sullivan found himself in front of a jury in federal court. Prosecutors said he kept the hack secret because he knew it would hurt his reputation, while Sullivan's defence lawyers argued that he was just doing his job and trying to stop people's data from being leaked. Sullivan was ultimately found guilty. He was fined $50,000 and ordered to serve 200 hours of community service. Today, no organisation worth its salt would attempt such a cover-up, but the case does demonstrate two things. One, that organisations are only too aware of the reputational risks of such a breach. But two, and perhaps more importantly, it demonstrates the duty of care that leaders have when it comes to their users' data, and the responsibility they have to be transparent when they mess up. Today, the repercussions can be very serious if they fail in this duty. Earlier this year, the names and workplaces of every police officer and civilian member of staff at the PSNI, that's the Police Service of Northern Ireland, was made public, including details of undercover officers.
These officers in Northern Ireland say they are shocked and dismayed.
This wasn't a hack. The PSNI accidentally shared this information for several hours in response to a Freedom of Information request for statistical information on PSNI staff. Security is still tight in Northern Ireland. Notwithstanding many years of relative peace, attacks still occur on PSNI members, so this was a pretty unforgivable breach of trust, and indeed eventually led to the resignation of the Northern Ireland Police Chief, Simon Byrne. The costs to the service are likely to run into the many millions once fines and compensation have been paid. So depending on the type of information being leaked, the consequences can be extremely serious. We'll hear from Toby Lewis several times in this episode. Toby is the Global Head of Threat Analysis at Darktrace. He's been working in cybersecurity for almost 20 years, originally with the intelligence services, and he was one of the founding members of the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK.
I think for the last 10 years now, we've been seeing this ongoing rhetoric of technology around the internet, around just technology more generally, becoming more and more central to our lives. And I think that's a trend that's only going to continue. And I think for as long as you've got technology forming more and more of our day-to-day, whether that's business or personal, that always represents a risk that somebody could look to exploit somebody could look to target that. And I think particularly as we start to see more and more of our critical kind of government systems move online, there's been discussions around electronic voting, for example. And, we saw just a few weeks ago, we have a compromise, I think it was with the election sort of commission. So there was definitely some questions around how we kind of keep that sort of very quite sensitive private data safe.
Geopolitics is an important lens through which to look at cybersecurity. How do conflict or international tensions motivate cyber attacks? And how can data breaches impact international relations? We spoke to Neil Khatod about the geopolitics of cybersecurity, but first we asked Neil how he ended up in the US Army Cyber Command, in a role he has just recently left for the private sector.
I was commissioned out of West Point in 1994. I became a communications specialist, sort of signal officer, what we call them in the Army. And really, cyber wasn't a thing. It was about networking things and voice and eventually video and then data technologies, and did that for 30 years. And I came out of I had a job. I got to Central Command right about 2 weeks after Mosul fell to ISIS, and had to build the integrated network that took all the coalition video feeds from the drones and make them globally available. From there, I went and did some more work in the Middle East, and then moved to Germany, where I was in charge of an organization about 4,000 strong that delivered the network to the United States Army in Europe and Africa. After that job for 2 years, I came to Army Cyber and tried something new. It was very interesting. I'd always come at a network from building it and the availability perspective, also thinking about security, but just the basics. How do I patch a vulnerability? How do I have the basic principles in mind? And I moved into a job where I had to be in charge of the active defense posture of the United States Army, as well as the incident response. Completely different way of looking at that same network. And I learned an incredible amount in that. I have been very fortunate to work with the NATO Cyber Defensive Center of Excellence in Estonia, and they do a fantastic job of charting out the history of how geopolitics impacts the cyber domain and how it integrates with a national strategy. And they really focused on the Russian threat, because the Russians really did a great job when they went into Georgia many, many years ago, and integrating cyber attacks and electromagnetic spectrum attacks to shut down cell phone sites and networks as their forces were rolling in. We watched something very, very similar in the Ukraine. So there's, from an element of national power, clearly it is very easy to get into the game. The balance of power for many, many years, the entry level was nuclear weapons. But the entry was incredibly expensive and lots of research. There's lots of research in the cyber domain, and you need smart people, but the cost of entry is incredibly low. So we're seeing this as a tool of choice by more and more countries entering the space. There's also the threat of cyber crime, which is always there. It's interesting. I covered the Russian threat. If you look at geopolitics in a global sense, there's a North Korean threat. The Hermit Kingdom is always looking for hard cash. They have so many sanctions. It's an opportunity to fund things that otherwise wouldn't happen in that country. And so that's kind of the big idea, that those advanced persistent threats in those countries, in that country specifically, has to self-fund. So that's really their interest. And so as sanctions go up, or their sponsor nations pay them less attention, you'll see a spike in what these APTs are doing. And the Chinese threat, the Chinese have for years had a desire to modernize their country and their military. And when Western nations don't want to give over the intellectual property, it's a lot easier just to take it. Corporate espionage, with partner companies or taking defense secrets to build a fighter that might look and resemble a lot like a Eurofighter or a F-22. I don't know that that's the case, but clearly the case could be made for that as an option. And then there's an Iranian threat out there, similar to the Koreans, where as sanctions go up, stealing credentials and harvesting cash is definitely an option. The undermining of the balance of power in the Middle East, something the Iranians are very interested in. So there's a lot of space there as well. Those are the big floor players. And then you've got cyber criminals that are global, that are just interested in snatch and grab and secrets. There are the hacktivists that are out there trying to prove a point. There's lots of threats, and it's a whole industry of understanding those threats and keeping up with them.
But of course, it's not just about the state players. The Uber case we cited earlier is just one example of a private sector hack motivated purely by money. During Sullivan's trial, we learned about Uber's bug bounty program, where they would pay white hat researchers up to $10,000 to report security vulnerabilities. Not unusual per se, but the hackers in this case were demanding $100,000. These days, the figures demanded can be eye-watering. We asked Toby Lewis about cybercrime as big business.
I think the trend that we've seen over the last few years has definitely been from sort of cyber criminals who are looking to see how they can take greater advantage of this kind of new internet-connected world that we live in. We see that with the absolute proliferation of ransomware. You see it particularly in the US. I think a lot of the education system in the US, there's a lot of schools that are constantly being hit by ransomware. Pipelines, I mean, you've got that classic Colonial Pipeline incident that happened a year or two ago now. And I think what that shows is actually you've got a criminal attacker who has the ability to bring down some really quite significant disruption onto a really, really broad community. And they can do that and then say, well, we'll do it again unless you pay us some money. So look, I think ransomware, it's one of these things of, look, it's here to stay. It's not going anywhere. For as long as it's profitable, for as long as the attackers can make money from it, they're only going to keep doing it. They are a business in their own right. They're going to be looking for opportunities to constantly improve that return on investment, to improve the likelihood they'll get payments, to increase the costs that they can charge, whilst at the same time lowering some of their own costs. And we've seen that over the last few years with almost like a move to a franchise model, where effectively they can push some of those costs out to operators that are slightly more fringes, whilst also changing some of their tactics. We saw a few years ago things like deleting backups, for example, to almost force the payment of the ransom itself. So yeah, I think for me, some of the tradecraft changes we'll see is just about improving return on investment, treating ransomware as if it was a business.
And those business models are getting ever more sophisticated. To understand more about this, we spoke with Iva Tasheva, co-founder and cybersecurity lead at Cyan, a cyber consultancy based in Brussels that works with large public and private organizations on their security strategies.
10, 15 years ago, maybe the hackers were either very skilled individuals that were doing it out of the challenge to hack, together with maybe government organizations which wanted to ensure that they have the security in place. Today, we see that cybercrime is a business. You don't need to have technical skills. You don't need to have talent. You just need motivation and maybe a little bit of time to research what is your best crime option. But you could find all the tools to hack. You could find all information basically online. This is, I think, what we didn't envisage in the past. We have seen our vulnerabilities, but we have not seen how the threat is going to evolve. I think it's going to get worse because cyber domain is going to be more attractive, appealing, because more of the activities are going to be connected to the internet. I don't know how it's going to evolve, honestly, because there's always pulling and pushing forces, and it all depends on how we also act on our side. But in general, we didn't do great in protecting our critical infrastructure because we lived in the comfort zone of peaceful time. We believed up until a couple of years ago that there are rules of the game so that hackers won't attack hospitals, for instance. Because There's kind of ethical consideration behind the fact that cybercrime doesn't justify threatening people's lives. So we don't have this comfort anymore. We didn't do enough to protect ourselves. We have to live with the consequence.
Elections are the backbone of democracy. Hackers had access to the personal data of tens of millions of people for more than a year, after infiltrating the systems of the Electoral Commission.
The Electoral Commission announced has been the subject of a cyber attack, highlighting that the UK's democratic process, its institutions and its data remain a target for hostile actors online. They went undetected with access to millions of records for more than a year.
Federal agencies, state governments, and major universities have been hit with a campaign of data theft and ransomware. Johns Hopkins University and its health system says the data breach may have impacted sensitive personal and financial information, including contact information and health billing records.
It's been described as a mass cyber heist, data stolen from underneath companies' noses, and now on a hacker's website. A warning in broken English. The gang, called Clock, boast, "Chances that we download a lot of your data as part of exceptional exploit." As well as the boast, an ultimatum was issued to the dozens, maybe even hundreds of organisations affected. Get in touch with us to discuss a ransom payment, or we'll publish your data online. The BBC, Boots, Aer Lingus and British Airways are just some of the organisations we know about.
More than a year ago, Uber heard from these hackers that they had found a way to get information, names, telephone numbers, that sort of information on 50 million riders, and then information on 7 million drivers, and most importantly, driver's license numbers for 600,000 drivers. And the concern here is that that's information that Uber was required to disclose and didn't. And so now, more than a year later, with a new CEO, Dara Khosrowshahi, the company is deciding to come forward and say that they should have disclosed this information, and here's what happened.
The FBI, Interpol, and the Ontario Provincial Police are now helping to investigate a ransomware attack on 5 Ontario hospitals. The IT provider for the facilities says patient and employee data is at risk.
The list of super tools and products available to protect us from cyber attacks is endless. But of course, like everything else, technology is only part of the picture. And an organisation is sometimes only as secure as the weakest link in its supply chain. So how do they respond to this rapid evolution in technology as cyber attacks become more and more sophisticated? Bill McCluggage is the former Chief Information Officer for the Irish Government and former Deputy Chief Information Officer for the UK Government, and has worked for many, many years on cybersecurity strategy for both governments and private entities.
Small organizations to very large organizations, to organizations that have spent hundreds of millions of pounds on defensive information security and cybersecurity, and all of a sudden find that their supply chains have been breached, and they've never really looked at the back door. They've never really looked, for instance, I was just thinking about a sort of an analogy. It's like, locking your house and putting security cameras around it, and then giving the electrician a set of keys to your house and not knowing what the electrician's likely to be doing. And you just leave them with the electrician. Don't worry about it. You're going to look after my house, aren't you? It is very much an area where the defensive postures have been put in place. Large amounts of money have been spent by many organizations, especially government, because they have got a requirement to ensure the security of data. And of course, we're driven in cybersecurity by CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And many people are turning around and going, right, okay, well, we've got the confidentiality breaches we've just seen. Well, it wasn't cybersecurity that breached the PSNI's big data. It was a failure of a process. So when you look at the whole realm of how you protect confidentiality, integrity, and availability, it's not just about technical solutions. So governments are now faced with business processes that are maybe not as robust. They're faced with technology where they've outsourced to suppliers, and that supply chain is not as strong. And directors in businesses and small business are faced with exactly the same issues. It's very difficult for a technical specialist in cybersecurity to talk at a business level in many cases, and for business leaders to understand the impact and the risks they're running. how do you get to a point where board directors, senior managers can understand the risks, the impacts, the same way as you do due diligence on finance with suppliers and customers, etc. You should be doing the same sort of stuff with the supply chain. You just have to get down into the basics of what assets do we have, how are we protecting them, what assurance levels are we relying on, and are they I always come up with this. There's a difference between reassurance and assurance. So somebody can come to you and say, that's all right. It's going to be okay on the night. Don't worry about it. I've got control of it. That's reassurance. Assurance is actually seeing it, believing it because you've seen it. The tests, the metrics. I refer back to the most recent, big breach here on the island of Ireland, which is PSNI one.
It has just been announced that there has been a major data and security breach involving officers at the Police Service of Northern Ireland. The Assistant Chief Constable of the PSNI, Khatod, has been speaking in the last few minutes. Let's have a listen.
Northern Ireland-related terrorism, and this is the last thing that anybody in the organisation wants to be hearing this evening. So I owe it to all of my colleagues to make sure that this is investigated thoroughly, and we've initiated that. The information was taken down very quickly, but nevertheless, I do appreciate the concern that it will cause. But what I would say is, although the error was our own, once that information was out there, if anybody did have access to it, I would ask them to delete it straight away.
Police officers in Northern Ireland say they are shocked and dismayed after a major data breach which saw their personal and employment details published online. The data was accidentally included in a response to a Freedom of Information request at a time when the threat of terror attacks against officers is classed as severe. Northern Ireland's Assistant Police Commissioner apologised for what he called a simple human error.
Some details were released at some point this afternoon relating to every police officer and member of staff. The Police Federation already demanding answers on this, given that surnames, staff numbers, roles and where officers were based were published accidentally.
Why suddenly is that freedom of information requests, subject access requests, whatever? Why did that cause a problem for them? Because it was a business process that failed. It wasn't, a technical issue. So internal audit should have been catching that at the early stages. That should have been in a risk register, and an external audit also should have been looking at it. So there were several areas that failed, and they all came together in, I suppose, using an old analogy, a perfect storm. Sometimes you end up turning around and saying, well, the technology's there and the human is to blame. Well, actually, the human isn't necessarily to blame because humans are inconsistent. And I'm a great believer that cybersecurity should also have specialists who are not necessarily technical. Workplace psychologists are tremendous people because they can look at the way things are happening and turning around and say, well, that actually isn't the right way to deal with it. People get tired of awareness training. If you run it too often, people sort of breach. So phishing being the big example. How many times have you gone through security awareness and it's a phishing focus? And then you turn around and say, well, phishing will always be socially engineered or generally socially engineered to get you into a position where you're in a panic. You'll click on something because it's a demand for, money, or it's the tax man, or it's whoever turning around and telling you that actually there's a problem and you have to deal with it immediately. And that's quite difficult if you haven't taken the psychological issues into consideration.
As Bill points out, the role of people, of humans, is only gaining in importance. This series is called Future Human after all. It's widely recognised that the industry just doesn't have enough of the right people with the right skills to combat cybercrime. According to the World Economic Forum's Global Cybersecurity Outlook 2023 report, the world needs 3.4 million more cybersecurity experts to support today's global economy. But the industry is struggling to fill that gap. When we chatted, Bill pointed to the gender disparity, which, if fixed, could go a long way to a solution. The National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK says that only 17% of the UK's cybersecurity workforce are women. Now that's a problem that needs to be addressed, as is diversity in general in the sector, given that cybercrime often has social engineering at its core. Here's Toby again.
I think there's an element of generative AI that we're still trying to really learn and understand how it can be best exploited. And so some of the, I suppose, arguably early public attempts that you've seen, yes, they've got some pitfalls around them. I've seen pictures generated with people with 3 fingers or 4 elbows or something that isn't quite perfect. But look, that's only going to improve and improve over time. And so when I think about what generative AI could do in the future, for me, from a cybersecurity context, the area that we focus on the most is around, well, how could generative AI be used to exploit the human? How could generative AI be used to create something so convincing that the most aware security user would still fall for it, would still click on the link, would still open up the attachment? And I think with the power of generative AI, you're able to produce some really quite legitimate looking social engineering, and not just, well done, you've won the lottery, or something relatively generic. You can make it really, really targeted. There is a broader question, which is, well, how do we defend against that? And social engineering has always been sort of solved by more training our users, teaching our users not to click things. Users have to click things. Like, they have to open up attachments in emails. They have to read emails from people they've never met before. We can't just say, be careful. Like, that doesn't work as a process. I think it helps raise the bar, absolutely. If nothing else, training our users improves our ability to get users to tell us when they think they've seen something suspicious. So it's more of an early warning system than it is a prevention mechanism in my own personal right. So I think in reality, I think we have to recognize that we can no longer just 100% sort of just, I suppose, put all our eggs in the one basket and say, it's up to you users, please don't click on stuff. We've kind of got to make the environment safe enough around it so if they do click on something, it shouldn't be the worst day in the world. We should have fail safes in place. We should let technology do the work. We should make sure the systems themselves are as hardened as it makes sense to do so for our organization. We should stop that even if a link is clicked on, well, actually, there are some checks going on in the background to make sure that if that link is malicious, nothing really happens, whether they clicked on it or not.
There's no doubt the future will see ever more new technologies to commit and to fight cybercrime, whether that be through the likes of generative AI or the arrival of quantum computing. But there's also a human-centered approach to this that looks set to change the way we approach cybersecurity. Here's Neil again.
Although it's not a 80-foot tall robot that's coming to break into your house, it's something to prepare for. The encryption methods and the way we keep privacy together for the average consumer, for businesses, for governments, will become obsolete. And so as we start preparing our budgets 3 to 5 years from now, being able to invest into new technology, research and development for those types of algorithms that are quantum resistant, that can encrypt things at a level we can't right now. I mean, AES 256 is kind of the standard that will be broken fairly easily with quantum. Right now, traditional computing, it's breakable, but it's not really, you really got to want to break it. In quantum, I think that'll change. So there'll be new technologies, new techniques. I think one of the things that's very interesting, there will be no silver bullet, no one thing. The world is dealing with a shift in thought from how you secure networks. We used to have a moat and castle design where as long as I've got high walls and a moat, we're okay. That would be your firewalls and your perimeter defense, and everything inside, we just assume it's okay. But over years of breaches and things, and we go, okay, we do the postmortem. How do we clean that up? We patch this thing. We replace this device. We're finding that there's no one way to do that. So instead of building the walls 10 feet higher and digging the trench 4 feet longer, you have to assume that you've been breached and that you have to validate the person who is using the machine and the machine to every resource you're going to get. That you actively hunt inside that network to see, is there somebody doing something they shouldn't? And then you have to baseline, how does that network normally operate? What's out of the norm? Do I send somebody to go check that out? So these are exciting times. All those concepts are called zero trust.
Zero trust is a fascinating concept in that it focuses on behaviours and processes rather than just the technology. It feeds into what Toby said earlier about social engineering. So we were keen to learn more about the idea. We spoke to Gal Helemski, whose career in cybersecurity also began in the army as a system programmer and an instructor in the computer programming unit. When she left the army, she worked in cybersecurity startups before co-founding Plain ID.
Think about yourself when you're going to an airport, right? When you go to an airport, nobody there really knows you, right? The guy at the door, the front desk, and then when you need to go through a security check, and then you need to go through the gate, and eventually end up sitting in your seat. So how zero trust applies there? The way it applies is that none of those control points know you. They are always asking you for verification. They are asking for your passport or an ID. Additionally, they would be asking, as you move forward, they would be asking for more proof and more credentials, and the criteria or the policies for you to move forward until you end up in your seat in the plane would just increase. For example, at the beginning, when you enter the airport, probably nobody is asking too many questions, but then there's a point where you need to show your passport to actually check in your luggage. And then at the security checkpoint, you also need to maybe remove your shoes and open your bags and show what's there. And if you have liquids, you can't go in. So there is additional security policy that says, no, it's not enough that you prove who you are by showing the passport, but additionally, we need to check additional criteria that apply to yourself to enable you to move forward. And that just go on and on until you finish that journey. And that's really zero trust. Zero trust means none of those control points trust you to begin with. You need to prove yourself. And the way which you prove yourself can just increase during the journey until you end up getting what you need, which is, access to data in the virtual world or doing whatever operation. I think the physical world has applied zero trust in a very good way in many cases, like airports, but the digital world has a lot to do. There's still a very big gap there. I think the majority of the digital world is doing the passport check at the front desk. And in most cases, it ends there, which is not a very good situation. We need to continue the journey of zero trust all the way in. We can't skip security controls. We can't skip the gate verification, nor the check when we enter the airplane itself. And if we look at where it stands today, most of the companies are still early in the journey. By the way, this is another thing which is very important to understand. Zero trust is not a single solution. It's not a product which you buy and implement and that's it, you're done. No, zero trust is a program. And you need to be aware that is a program. You need to be aware what are the parts that you need to consider as part of that program and have a strategy how to implement in order to achieve a full zero trust solution.
So there we have it. With the growth of generative AI and the promise of quantum, most experts we speak to currently believe zero trust may be the future of cybersecurity. In any case, we hope you feel better informed about the state of cybersecurity today and how it might look in the future. As we all spend so much of our time online, it's a crucial area that needs to be tackled top-down in organisations large and small if we, the users, are to be protected. There's no question that cybercrime today is big business and the perpetrators have few ethical concerns. Just as our methods of protecting ourselves will continue to improve exponentially, so will the criminals' methods. If you're of a certain age, you'll remember the days when it was enough to turn up at the airport 45 minutes before your flight. Just as security at the airport has become a bit of a trudge, it hasn't stopped us flying. So in the future, we may just have to live with the idea of zero trust being the norm when it comes to our online lives too. This series is curated by the Silicon Republic team and produced by Shaun and Maurice. The interviews were conducted by myself and Silicon Republic editor Jenny Darmody. The podcast is part of Future Human on Silicon Republic, and for more great content, from filmed fireside chats to deep dive articles, visit siliconrepublic.com/future-human. Thanks again to our series sponsor Hays, the experts in recruitment and workforce solutions.